Hey, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 2. It's on self and perception, so get ready because it's about to be really fun. I'm just kidding. Hopefully, it's at least very interesting. So, the first slide that you see here is not from our textbook. It's a slide, it's a picture of what could be seen as either an older woman or a younger woman, and it's available online. And the point of the picture, which I usually talk about in class, is to ask, which do you see? Do you see the older woman or the younger version? And the reason I ask that is because it depends on your perception, right? Reality is based on our perception. And if we don't share the same perception with other people, we're going to be coming from different fields of experience, maybe, and then there can be opportunities for miscommunication. So today we're going to start by talking about the self as well as perception, specifically the nature of our self. I know it probably sounds like, oh, geez, but I think it's interesting. And then also how we perceive other people. And just like with the lecture for chapter 1, we're going to take the information we talk about today and build on it in our future lectures. And then hopefully you can apply it to real life situations. So moving on to the second slide, you see a cute little picture, I think it's cute, of a little kitten staring in a mirror. And what the kitten sees back as a reflection is a lion. And what we're talking about here is the nature of self, or how we see ourselves. Our textbook and our authors would say, well, the self really comes from evolving or changing views of ourself. The first being self-awareness, then self-concept, and then self-esteem. So let's talk about each of those. Self-awareness is, like it sounds, how much or to what extent are you aware of yourself? And I know that sounds really easy, like, of course I'm aware of myself, but I'm in my 40s now, and I can share with you, I don't think I was always very self-aware. I thought I was at each stage of life. But if you were to ask me, I don't know, 10 years ago, what's my idea of fun? I might have had to stop and think about it and say, I'm not sure I know, because fun to me at one age looks different than fun at another. Or what do I value? Or what do I like about myself? Those things, as I said, evolve or change over time. So we are best able to communicate and our best selves when we have a strong self-awareness, right? And so you'll see one of the homework assignments asks you to answer a series of prompts, not because I want personal information about you. I don't know if what you write is true or not, but it's just an exercise in increasing your self-awareness. The second, as I said, was self-concept. If asking the question, who am I, is part of self-awareness, then the answer to the question, what you decide to be true, is your self-concept. We have something called a self-verification theory, which is that we will choose partners and people in our lives that support how we see ourselves. So, for example, if I was raised and constantly told, let's say, that I was not worth anything, I was stupid, or I was lazy, or I was this or that, and if I start to internalize that to be true about myself, I am lazy, I am not good for anything, whatever. The self-verification theory says I'm going to seek out people who make me feel like I'm stupid and I'm not worth anything, because there's just a nature in us to want to be right. Even though it doesn't feel good, we're going to look for that. So I think that's really eye-opening, because again, if you aren't really self-aware, you then are definitely not aware of your self-concept, but you are going to be attracting people based on the concept you have of yourself. So I think that's, again, interesting to think about, because from there, the way you value those things about yourself determines your self-esteem. So, for example, if I have asked the question, for self-awareness, who am I? And the answer to that, or my self-concept, is I'm lazy and stupid and worthless. And I think to be valuable, you're supposed to be the opposite of those things. You're supposed to be smart, and you're supposed to be successful, and you're supposed to have a certain GPA. there's a disconnect between what I value and what I see to be true in myself. So therefore, that disconnect means I'm going to have a low self-esteem. It's only when the things that I value and believe to be true about myself match and are positive that I can have a high self-esteem. So this is why you see people who, let's say, train really hard as athletes, for example, or study really hard and then go on to medical school. If they honestly believe they are successful and they or smart or beautiful or whatever, and they value those things, they will have a higher self-esteem. It's very possible for, let's say, an athlete to have low self-esteem because, and Lewis Howes is an athlete who talks about this. He trained hard he was in the NFL. He was trained hard for a lot of years. And then he had an injury and it took him out of the game. And then he had to really struggle with self-awareness. Who am I without football? What do I hold to be true about myself? And he learned that the reason he worked so hard at football prior to having to get out of it was because he thought his value was tied to that. And so when he was no longer playing football, he had a much lower self-esteem because he thought, well, then what am I? Where's my value? And again, as we talked about in the first chapter, intrapersonal or communication with ourselves happens before we talk to other people. So if you're coming from a place of low self-esteem based on how you see yourself and what you value, that's going to roll over into the conversations and relationships you have with other people. Hope you will read the chapter because there's a lot more about that. I think some of these next concepts are, I think, fun or interesting to think about, but also should come up at later times in life. Most people are aware of what these terms mean. So the first, when we talk more about the nature of self, we're looking at a new slide, and the first term is the self-discrepancy theory. That's when you compare the person you think you are and the person you think you're supposed to be. Again, this is kind of relates to self-esteem. If your family, if you grew up with your family telling you you're going to be a business major, you're going to be a business major, and you're more of an artist or a painter, then your ought self and your ideal self don't match. Again, and so there's a discrepancy, there's a difference that's going to cause some challenge or inner turmoil for you. One way to kind of get around that would be to say, well, who's deciding what my ideal self is? Is that coming from me or is that coming from somebody else? And if it's coming from me, where did I get that? Who says I need to be this other thing? So we can process some of those things. And this is certainly not a counseling perspective. I don't have a degree in psychology, but just from a communication and an intrapersonal communication perspective, we can at least start thinking through these things. The other key term that you see here in terms of the nature of yourself is a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think most people have heard of this. Self-fulfilling means you have decided, and a prophecy means this thing is going to come true. And because you have decided it's going to come true, it does. You see a picture here of a meme from Mean Girls, the movie. And I forget her name. I think it's Regina in the movie. And she says, stop trying to make self-fulfilling prophecies happen. It's not going to happen, which basically is a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's ironic, maybe a little funny. I don't know. But I see people make negative self-fulfilling prophecies all the time. Let's say when they're preparing for a test or a speech or a job interview, they do a lot of the intrapersonal communication. They decide, this isn't going to go well. I'm not prepared. I'm not good at tests. I never interview well. People are going to worry about what I look like when I'm speaking. And because you've decided things are going to go badly, they do. Mostly because you decided they were going to go badly. I had a manager at one point who had some great skills and other things were not so great. But one great thing I learned from her was try to go into every meeting with your desired outcome in your mind as if that's what's going to happen. Because positive self-fulfilling prophecies can happen as well. You may not get the job if it's an interview, and you may not have everybody love your speech, and you may not ace the test. But if you go in with a positive self-fulfilling prophecy of, I've studied the best I can. I'm prepared. I think this is going to be a great learning opportunity. Whatever positive thing you're going to say, you're going to walk away from that feeling much more positive about the situation. And then I want to talk a little bit about the perception process. And this has to do, we were talking about the nature of selves, and now we're talking about perception still, but perception of others. There's a 3-step process that your book talks about. And so you see the picture that comes from our book. The first is that you select which information you want to pay attention to. And again, each person, if you're trying to communicate with somebody about, let's say, a car accident you saw or gossip or something, each person might select different information. So that's important to think about. Secondly, after you select information, then you're going to start organizing it, and you're going to organize it into some kind of pattern that makes sense to you without even realizing it. This is just something that we do. And then the third is we start making interpretations or attaching meanings to the things that we perceived or saw or heard. So again, if I am, let's say at a party, and I see my boyfriend and let's say another woman talking, I could select, oh, that's what I choose to focus on in that moment, is that these people are talking, and oh, I'm watching where her hand is, and oh, I'm watching how he's looking at her. I'm going to pay attention to what seems like negative bits maybe, and then I'm going to organize that based on the things that I've known to be true, let's say of other people I've dated. If they cheated on me a lot, I'm going to start almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, decide, oh, she's doing that because, and he's doing that because, and that's my interpretation of what I saw. Obviously, I could be very wrong. I could have misinterpreted any number of things that I saw or heard, and that's where arguments ensue, right? If I were to talk to my boyfriend about that after the fact, he might say, no, I didn't look this way, and she didn't touch that, or whatever. Then we have opportunity for miscommunication or conflict. So I think it's helpful to know and be mindful of the process of perception. You know, how did we get to this place? Which is, first, what information did you select? Second, how did you organize it? And third, what meaning did you attach to it? Okay. In terms of perceiving others, there are a few key concepts that I would want to make sure you're aware of. And again, they're elaborated more in the book. Hopefully you'll read that. One is that we make attributions. An attribution is like giving an explanation for why things happen the way they are. So if I attribute that girl touching my boyfriend's hand to her flirting with him, then that's the explanation I've given for why she's touching his hand. It may or may not be accurate, but I've attributed her actions to flirting. That's my way of making sense of it. Sometimes we make attributions based on external factors, and sometimes we make them based on internal factors. External factors are outside of the person, obviously, and internal factors would be like personality, again, just emotions, whatever is related to the individual as a person would be an internal. Maybe if I'm going through a difficult time in my life, that would be an internal factor. So as we talk, this next slide talks about some dangers that happen when we make attributions and we don't really think about them. One is called a fundamental attribution error. Fundamental is like basic, attribution is explanation, and error. So there's an error in the basic assumption or explanation I'm making. That happens when we attribute other people's behaviors to internal rather than external factors. So back to the dating situation. Again, if this is my boyfriend with a female, if it looks to me, if I've attributed some flirty behavior based on the things that I perceived, I might say, well, that's because an internal factor, my boyfriend is a cheater. That's why this thing happened. That's why it happened. He's a cheater. And that's why it's called an error, because I can't really make a basic explanation for something without knowing the whole story. So again, a fundamental attribution error is when we decide that there's an explanation simply based on who the other person is internally, because it doesn't give us all the facts. That's why it's an error. Then we have something called an actor observer effect. This is when, if we were in the same situation, let's say I'm at the same party and a male starts, or could be a female, but in this case, let's just say it's reversed, so it's a male, is talking to me. In my mind, I'm not thinking, and maybe the same touching and the same glances or the same posture is happening, but in my mind, I'm thinking, well, of course, this doesn't look like cheating because I'm not a cheater, right? If this were going to look like cheating, it would be because of that other person, certainly not because anything I'm doing. So again, it's how our way of thinking of something. If I decide you've done something bad because you're a bad person, that's a fundamental attribution error. If I say, yeah, but I'm not the bad person here, I was just in a situation, then it's an actor observer effect. We also have something called a self-serving bias, which is similar to that. And that is when something really good happens. When something bad happens, it's obviously not me. But when something good happens, it's because I'm awesome, because that's who I am. And that's why it's called self-serving bias, because we don't give others the same credit necessarily. Maybe we do, but when we say this good thing happened because I'm this great thing, then it's a self-serving bias. Also, along the same lines of perception and other people, we have something called stereotyping, which is probably not a new concept for you guys. That's when we form an impression of others by categorizing them and then also placing some kind of evaluation on them, right? So we talked about the perception process. You selected information, you organized it, and then you're interpreting it. And then when you say, and so based on this thing I'm seeing of this person, she must be like all those other people that look this way or talk this way or vote this way or dress or whatever, have these kinds of relationships. That's obviously not always accurate. Sometimes stereotypes can be helpful. Like if I'm preparing a speech for a class and I have, mostly what appear to be all 20-year-olds in my class, I can make some stereotypes, which is to say, okay, maybe it's probably fair to say they're better at technology than if I had a different group in the class, right? Or something like that. We can use it to inform our decisions, but as soon as we place judgment or attach any negative value to what we think is true of others, then we have other issues, which we'll talk more about in the chapter on culture. What you see here is just at the very bottom of the slide are two pictures of what would appear to be a woman with things like lipstick and lips, a heart, because maybe only women like love, I don't know, a martini glass, arts, which are like painting a house, because that's obviously where only women go. I'm being facetious, of course, and then flowers. So those would all be stereotypes, which may or may not be true of people, but fall into that category of quote unquote women. Then we have the male side of that. And the male picture gets a picture of weights and what looks like either chemistry or finance with charts going up, a computer and money, because, only men care about money. Just again, being facetious. A brain. I think that one's interesting. As well as a wrench, because, the suggestion here is that only men will do handiwork. Again, some of those things might be true of each sex, but we also know that sex is not even the same thing as gender. So it's just something to be mindful of when we are making perceptions, certainly when those perceptions turn into judgments of other people. So we talked about kind of a lot in these last 20 minutes. First, we talked about the nature of ourself, and then we talked about perceiving others. I hope that this is a helpful addition to the lesson material that you'll be reading. I find chapter 2 really fascinating. Please let me know at any time if you have any questions. You can see me during office hours or call me. Also, you can send me an email. The information's on the syllabus. All right, thanks guys. Bye.